Hi, welcome to Tim Oates Live. I'm Ashley Capaldi. I'm the social media manager at Cambridge Assessment, and we have, of course, Tim Oates with us. He's our group director of assessment research and development. So we've got quite a few questions to get through, Tim, in just half an hour. So I'll go straight to the first one. We have Stephen Wren, who came in on Twitter. Does the changing curricula effectively simultaneously at all key stages increase the likelihood of discontinuities in the overlearning experience from reception to year 13 as students study to varying degrees incompatible mixes of old and new, as Stephen calls it?
Well, hardly a short question, but I do understand what he's concerned about. It's really essentially that you face real difficulty implementing a new national curriculum in a country. You can decide to start it afresh, as it were, and only introduce it in the first year, but then you wait for a very long time for it to pass right the way through the education system. In essence, it takes 11 years or more for a new curriculum to become fully established in the system. That's one way you can do it. Another way is to introduce it simultaneously across all ages, but then, as the question implies, you have some children who have not studied the whole curriculum towards the top of primary schooling and secondary schooling, and it's very tough for them. I think because education is quite politicised in England compared with many other nations, and there have over the last 3 or 4 decades been a lot of policy reversals. In terms of this new curriculum implemented in 2014, the government felt that it was important to implement it simultaneously across the system. And that does place enormous pressures on teachers, schools, parents, pupils. There's no two ways about it. It's a tough and difficult decision, and it has placed a lot of pressure on the system and on society. But we do know what the implications are, and we do know how certain groups of pupils will be affected by it. And so schools are in a good position to be able to support them. So in essence, though, those are the difficult decisions that you face when you have a new national curriculum.
Okay, let's move on now. We had just from John on Twitter. Do you see any weaknesses in the Pisa methodology and the way in which it is used by countries to make decisions about education reform?
Okay, that's something we've been discussing a lot recently amongst researchers here and with researchers outside across the world as well as just domestic. I had a big chat with Gabriel Halasagran about this only very recently before I went to an OECD working group with some colleagues. We think PISA is a very good measurement. I mean, the OECD works very hard to make sure that the measurement is good. It then analyses the data from those measurements of 15-year-olds across a range of countries. And that's all pretty good. I mean, it's state-of-the-art stuff. Of course it has its limitations. Of course it has potential biases. And I think we pretty much understand those. Where it all gets a bit more difficult is trying to distill out core messages right the way across the world. And OECD does try to do that. We're a lot more reserved in our judgment about that. We're a lot more nervous about that process. At Cambridge, we spend a great deal of time thinking about how we can draw messages which transcend different national systems. It's not an easy business. And that's the weakest aspect of the OECD's activity around PISA. And I think they have got it wrong in the past. And unfortunately, some of the messages which have gone out are taken extremely seriously by policymakers. We've done a bit of corrective research and corrective messaging ourselves. So to summarise, I think PISA measurement, as good as it probably can be, does have limitations. The top-line messaging, though, much more problematic and I think much more controversial and contentious.
Okay. We have another Pisa question. This is in just from James. What's your take on the controversy surrounding the use of computer-based assessment in Pisa 2015?
Now, that does refer to a big change in PISA, moving from paper-based assessment of 15-year-olds in systems on a sample basis to an on-screen delivery. We've done quite a bit of research here in terms of assessment and some in terms of learning, research on the changes which occur as a result of moving from paper to on-screen. It is a very different cognitive process. It's a very different process of competence. So it does affect and can compromise assessment. We've seen some of the Asian nations drop probably implausibly in Pisa. Now, OECD did do good background research on the changes. They did some small-scale studies. But small-scale studies don't always replicate what happens in practice when you do something across the world at a very large scale. So we do think that the measurement was adversely affected by the move to computer or on-screen delivery. TIMSS, by the way, another big international survey, which assesses at 2 age points, is going on screen next year, and they're busily trying to learn from the Pisa experience. But our conclusion so far is that some of the movement of countries up and down the league tables is probably explained by some of the effects of changing mode.
Oh, okay. Another question from James, taking it closer to home. What effect do you think the rise of multi-academy trusts will have on regional differences in educational attainment?
Well, we do have a very, very complex and diverse education system in this country compared with many other nations. And the introduction of academy status and then academy chains has changed the whole landscape. It's changed the landscape of control, curriculum control, management, leadership, and so on. I think it will change the pattern of attainment. We kind of see the introduction of local curriculum aims across these mats, and these mats are distributed in different ways. Some of them are concentrated in particular localities, some are spread across the whole of the nation, some of them are really big. So I think, yes, it will, and I'm cutting a long story short, we need to monitor it. And that we can do because we've got very good data on individual children in this country, the NPD, the National Pupil Database. We in Cambridge and a lot of other research groups do really good analysis of different social groups, different regions, and so on. And we will be examining the impact of these new arrangements, where it's the objectives, the aims, the management model of the MAT, which can introduce greater consistency across schools that exist in very different regions.
Okay. Jonathan Simon's taking it a bit more broad now. What's the single most harmful educational belief or theory out there, and why do some people advocate it?
Well, thank you, Jonathan.
We've got time, take your time.
Obviously asking a question which opens up a huge bear pit, because I can undoubtedly offend a very large number of people. And I'm going to be very honest, and I probably am going to offend people. I would say, what's the single thing? Well, actually, Jonathan and I have discussed this. I mean, the single thing which really annoys me, a single thing, people who have the answer, this is going to save
Silver
education.
bullet, yeah.
A silver bullet, indeed. And education is full of people wandering around with this simple solution will solve all our problems in education. And the history of the development of education is littered with the damage caused by people who think that single things hold the answer. Regrettably, like so many things, education is complex. It's a complex system. It has the impact of social views, the change in youth culture. This affects education, the views of young people, the aspirations of parents, the economy, and so on and so on. And we've done analysis of this. Our analysis of the performance of education systems around the world takes this complexity and the interaction of these factors into account. But I suppose I could answer Jonathan's question quite directly, actually. If I've got a list of things in my mind which have done damage, this sounds a bit esoteric, but it was the impact of postmodernist thinking. So whilst postmodernist thinking was very helpful in it showed us that texts contain underlying implicit messages, that things can be signifiers of deeper cultural processes, that different knowledge systems have different assumptions, different cultures have different knowledge systems and so on. That's all very useful. But also something came out of it which I think is insidious and difficult, which is that every point of view is equally legitimate. And I don't think that's the case, either in natural science or social science. And I think that's had a very difficult impact on education, because it's undermined the authority of knowledge which we've accumulated through difficult processes over a very long period of time.
Okay. We'll go back to another one from Martin now on Twitter. So another difficult question. Did you foresee the problems that teachers would encounter when we moved to assessing without national curriculum levels? So this is a movement, I
Yeah.
think, known as Beyond Levels on social media.
That's life beyond levels. That's
Yeah.
I mean, it's an excellent question because in essence it differentiates between the rationale for removing levels, which I think was incontrovertible. Piles of evidence, domestically and internationally, that levels had reached a point where they needed to go. It's having, in too many places, it was having an adverse impact on children's progression, either by them labelling themselves or each other, or through the way in which we tracked progress. So I think there was a huge pile of evidence, and I think we presented it to the Secretary of State at the time. The government considered it and rightly removed levels as a requirement on schools. But the question separates that from the issue of implementation. So once you've decided to do that, how do you implement it and what impact does that have? And I am very worried about the variation in the models which have emerged after the removal of levels. And did I foresee it? Well, in terms of personal culpability, yeah, we discussed it at the time. And the reason I think that the state didn't see fit to support new assessment processes in huge detail, i.e. make available a set of principles which schools could build new assessment systems on, was at the time they were also committed to a message which actually came from OECD, which is if you want high-performing schools, you have to unleash their autonomy. So the government didn't want to tell schools what to do. Now, I think it overinterpreted that advice from OECD. Or rather, it interpreted it correctly, but OECD overstated the case. And I think I was urging government at the time to make the principles of assessment without levels much clearer to all schools, and to help them build robust assessment systems. And I think an opportunity was lost there. It's since we've got some schools that assess, I think, brilliantly without using levels. A whole series of examples, and schools, of course, I've been into and looked at what they're doing. I think what it's now incumbent upon us to do as a system is to make sure that those examples of good practice are disseminated very widely in the system. And I think partially that's a job for Ofsted, not only to inspect, but to share good practice. So, yeah, hand up. Not only did we become aware of it, we were aware of it right from the outset, but the policy context meant that probably the right decisions weren't taken in terms of supporting schools at the time.
Okay. We'll move on now to Ed Dorrell on Twitter. Do you agree the assessment framework for SATs is not fit for purpose, especially moderation in the writing assessments? We've seen a lot in the press about primary school SATs writing assessments and some challenges kids have been having with it.
Yeah, so there are three things in there really. I can deal with them extremely quickly. There are the elements of the national assessment system which involve teacher assessment. So not national tests, but national teacher assessment. But it's still called national assessment because it's done with descriptors and it attempts to be as consistent as possible from school to school, teacher to teacher. We don't see good dependability out of those kind of arrangements, and that's not the fault of teachers. It just typically is not as dependable as external tests. And it also places a huge workload on teachers. And I think it's right that we constantly review whether we are getting the right balance of benefits out of something that we ask teachers to do in terms of pupil assessment. The second thing in that question is whether the national tests are fit for purpose, particularly the ones at the end of Key Stage 2. We've had some teething problems because new tests have had to be introduced with the new national curriculum. We've seen those teething problems. The tests are produced by the STA. The STA, they're a good bunch of people. They're on top of the practical matters. In our system, I think it's right that we have some formal testing at the end of Key Stage 2, at 11, at the point of transfer from primary to secondary. And I think it needs to be as dependable as possible. So it's quite right, I think, that tests should always feature in that. The third bit is writing. And the assessment of extended writing, we've done measurement on this for many, many decades. it's not desperately consistent. And it's right that we should explore new models like comparative judgment, and Daisy Christodoulou has promoted that, and we've done a lot of the theoretical work. The theory goes back to the 1930s. It is time that we explored these new types of measurement of extended writing quickly and for real to see whether we can scale them up. And they look as though they hold a lot of promise for introducing greater consistency without huge workload, which is a good balance of benefits.
Okay, good. And another sort of similar question from Tarjinder Gill, I hope I've got your name right. Are generic skills assessments redundant? For example, Key Stage 2 SATS reading paper. Is a set Year 6 curriculum or indeed national curriculum required even?
Okay. National curriculum is not national, of course. Not all schools are required to do it. I feel uneasy about that. I think around the world we see the best education systems having improved rapidly because there is a consistent and shared understanding of standards. And that's typically created in a society by something called typically a national curriculum, or correctly a set of national standards. And I think it's a good idea to have them. We've seen in the implementation of the national curriculum in this country, it was implemented in 1988, we saw an immediate improvement in the performance of girls in areas that they preferentially avoided in primary school, in areas of mathematics. It's good for equity and it's good for attainment. But there are many practical issues you face as to what level of detail that national curriculum or those national standards are expressed in, and how you support schools in their interpretation, how detailed the requirements are you make of schools. But I think it's right that we have a national framework of standards. Otherwise gaps open up between social groups across regions, and we've seen that historically. So I think it's good to have it. You need assessments, otherwise the curricula tend not to be taken seriously. We know how important assessment is, as long as it is, as it were, operates in good, is well synchronised with the aims and the needs of the curriculum, and the assessment doesn't distort the curriculum. We know that assessment should be part of the mix of a good education. So yeah, I think we should have assessment at the end of primary school. Generic skills, reading, is reading a generic skill? Probably. I think it's right that we assess reading. I want to know the range of texts which children can interpret and understand, how they can read them and what they get out of them. So the mechanics of reading, a skill, and comprehension, and underlying cognitive ability, yeah, we should assess those things.
Okay. We'll go to Sinead on Twitter now. You've said before, Tim, allegedly, that too much SPAG knowledge, that's spelling, punctuation, grammar, is required by the curriculum. Can this change, or are we stuck with it?
Yeah, now that's an interesting one. I've been quoted in newspaper articles recently about this, but not least because it caused such stress among schools, parents and pupils last year when the tests were deployed. Okay, so a couple of things. I think it's right, and indeed Debbie Myhill, who was one of the advisors to the government on the content of the national curriculum in respect of this language about language, meta-language. Her own work suggests that a measure of understanding of language about language in children does help attainment. Knowing what a verb is, knowing what an adjective is, understanding the underlying grammar of our language is helpful. Pushing it too far in primary, so that it becomes kind of a learning objective in its own right, is not necessarily supportive of the development of writing. That's what we know. So the specifications for Year 5 and 6 probably did push the technical content of this language about language too far. Interestingly, if you look at the data on the national tests, the kids didn't do as badly on the questions on fronted adverbials and so on as the press comment might make you imagine.
Okay.
But they probably did better than everybody thought because they were narrowly drilled in those things. Again, that's not very functional in terms of kids learning. You want children to memorise things. You want them to be able to retain them over time, over long periods of time, throughout their lives. But you don't want it to be the result of narrow drilling of things which aren't necessarily fundamental to performance. So what we will see, I think, is the level of understanding of these things, year 3, 4, 5, in the national curriculum, being defined by the kind of questions which are asked every year. A practice will build up about the interpretation of the extent to which children need to understand this complex language about language. In other words, we won't and we shouldn't expect so much of this higher order language about language. We want to see children's writing and thinking about difficult subjects become increasingly elaborated through language.
Mm-hmm.
And we can support that through a measure of them understanding the basics of language about language. That's what the research tells us.
Okay, we'll go to John Brunskill on Twitter. This is another broad one. How do we prevent the strong gains made in Key Stage 2 being lost in Key Stage 3?
Okay, it's a big question, but I can answer it very quickly.
Okay.
So it was right, I think, that Ofsted produced a report which highlighted the wilderness years of Key Stage 3.
Yeah.
They are a wilderness through which tumbleweeds blow in
So
a
that's
number
7,
of schools.
8, 9 before we go into GCSE
Yeah,
years, yeah? Okay.
yeah, that's right. And when we had Key Stage 3 testing, we identified a dip in performance. Interestingly, we did research around the world and we found a similar Key Stage 3 dip in many, many systems. And it could be to do with teenage maturation, as well as perhaps schools taking their foot off the accelerator. Now, I think that schools are looking at Key Stage 3, and it's right that they do so. Children have got scant few years between when they join secondary schools and when they take tough examinations at the age of 16. And therefore the learning progressions from 11 to 16 need to be outlined with great clarity, so children understand the movement that they need to constantly make in understanding and in what they can do. That doesn't mean a relentless treadmill of GCSE-style questioning, but it means very clear learning progressions to avoid Key Stage 3 being a time when kids are really not achieving what they could be, because they can learn so much during those years. I do know the problem of schools receiving kids with so much difference in their attainment from the many feeder primaries. And I've been to some very good schools recently that are doing a lot of work with their feeder primaries, helping them to understand the reading, the writing, the maths that's required in secondary. And in those schools, the kids really hit the ground running, and it means that much better use is being made of Key Stage 3.
Okay. We have a couple of questions from Hussein in from Twitter. So one specifically about one of our daughter organisations, Cambridge International. He asks, do some regions or countries perform better at certain subjects than others in the Cambridge International examinations?
Yeah, that's a great question, because around the world societies are changing so quickly, a rapid growth in middle class and aspiration around education. Yeah, we see a lot of variation, and that variation is it's a constant feature. The variation is constant, as it were. It's partially because we have a lot of cohorts coming and going with qualifications and systems around the world. If I can say something consistent right the way across all nations about that variation, it is strongly affected by social background, but it's also strongly affected by what happens in the classroom. So we see our role in Cambridge as supporting the highest possible learning activities in the classroom through good assessment, good learning materials, good support to teachers. And there we can see, if we do that, and what happens in the classroom, consistent with Hattie's work, if the pedagogy and the didactics are good, then we can do quite a lot to overcome social difference and the differences that result from social background.
Okay, and we'll quickly get the next question from Hussein in. We're coming to the end. He also asks, how useful are results or grades in showing a student's intelligence or knowledge? Do they even matter in real life?
Yeah, assessment's really useful. We want assessment to kind of permeate instruction in a seamless fashion. A teacher asking a demanding question of a group, which gets them thinking, and enables the teacher to understand, oh, those kids they're not getting it, and I need to give them more support, or this, I need to take this different approach. That's assessment too.
Mm-hmm.
And we see an absolute role for high quality formative assessment supporting learning, which is consistent with good preparation for summative assessment, done under secure conditions, which users perhaps some years later can really trust. So yeah, a good balance in formative assessment, all of it designed well, absolutely crucial, and all international evidence points towards that.
Okay. Interestingly, from someone Honey Pie Squared on Twitter,
Right.
how do you feel about norm-referenced versus criterion-referenced assessment in schools?
Okay, so that sounds like, what do I feel about black versus white?
Okay.
And this, it's shades of grey always.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as pure criterion-referenced
Mm-hmm.
assessment or pure norm-referenced assessment.
Okay.
They're always a complex mix of the two. What we need to do is optimise
Mm-hmm.
the mix for particular circumstances. It's interesting, some systems like Hong Kong go for quite radical assessment based much more on a norm reference paradigm. They rank kids and they rank schools, and that's anathema to many European educators. How can you actually set kids up one against another? Interestingly, it has the effect of almost everybody trying to climb over each other, schools and children, raising the attainment of everybody.
Okay.
And interestingly, they do it highly collaboratively. So even though the kids look as though that the assessment system would cause them to be in acute competition one with another, they help each other. Very interesting. So we make no assumptions about the right mix.
Mm-hmm.
We look at the context, we try different mixes and see what impact it has, and if it has beneficial impact, if there's more attainment, if there's better equity, and there's more engagement and enjoyment in the learning, then that mix of criterion and norm reference assessment will be seen to be working in that context. We don't know what to call what we do in this country. It's not pure criterion referencing, it's not pure norm referenced, it's called weak criterion referencing or cohort referencing. We've never known quite what to call it.
We need a new term
We
coined.
do.
Okay, we're coming to the end. We'll have to do this again, but let's finish on this nice positive one from Mary Myatt. This came in on Twitter. Should we be more or less optimistic about the future of assessment?
Okay, always good to hear from Mary, and she's doing fantastic work in supporting schools, particularly on assessment without levels. It's a great future for assessment. We've got some radical new assessment models being examined, crowdsourced assessment, the kind of work we're doing with Microsoft.
Yeah.
Really good. Engaging teachers in the production of assessment, with us providing the quality assurance, finding that some of the questions don't measure well, others do. That's the kind of work that we can do. But rich questions, those are the kind of thing, those rich questions can be produced by teachers. We're looking back into the history of assessment. So we've got our brilliant archive here in Cambridge, going back to the 1890s. Well, that's been raided in a very positive way by physicists, and we got Isaac physics out of it. Tough questions that 500,000 hits at peak time from teachers and from students. Kids and teachers like these tough questions from the past because it supports learning. New radical assessment models like comparative judgment. There's a lot of exciting stuff, and all of it, I think, dedicated to make sure that assessment supports learning in the most effective way.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Tim. And thank you everyone for watching, and we'll let you know when we do it again sometime. We've run out of time to answer all your questions, but thank you.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you everybody for your questions.